You solve this. Ha. If you can, the company is yours. The booming voice of Richard Blake, the CEO of Blake Industries, rang through the glass-paneled boardroom like thunder. His laughter bounced off the walls, a mix of arrogance and mockery. Around him sat a dozen of the company's top executives, all in tailored suits, sipping designer coffee, their eyes momentarily glued to a man who didn't belong. That man was Caleb. He stood near the door, worn-out shoes, faded overalls, and a mop in hand. He wasn't part of the meeting. He wasn't invited. He wasn't even supposed to be there. Not really. But he was there. Quiet. Watching. And he had been listening. For the last few minutes, the team had been obsessing over a complicated logic puzzle displayed on the digital screen. The CEO had issued the challenge earlier in the morning. Solve this equation, and I'll give you my corner office. It was supposed to be fun, a riddle for the sharpest minds in the building. A mental exercise to stimulate the leadership team. But no one had solved it. Not the CFO. Not the senior analysts. Not even the head of R&D, who had once published papers in mathematical modeling. Now, Richard had noticed something odd. The janitor, this man they barely noticed, was staring at the screen with focus. Not confusion. Not amusement. Focus. And so, in a moment of amusement, and perhaps a desire to embarrass, the CEO pointed at Caleb. You. Yeah, you with the mop. What's your name? The room turned toward Caleb, surprised that the CEO was even talking to him. Caleb, sir, he said politely. Well, Caleb, Richard said with a grin. You think you can solve this? Caleb hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of respect for boundaries. I don't mean to intrude, sir. I just noticed the structure of the problem. It's not a riddle. It's a pattern. A flawed model. His voice was calm, unshaken. He didn't try to impress. He didn't flinch. That's when Richard laughed again, the kind of laugh that people with power use when they don't expect to be challenged. You solve this. Ha. If you can, the company is yours. And then, silence. It was the kind of silence that's loud. The kind that makes people shift in their seats. The kind that separates one chapter of life from the next. Everyone in the room turned toward Caleb. He stood still for a moment, then slowly walked toward the screen. The clunk of his boots echoed across the marble floor. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't smiling. He was just focused. Who was this man? To everyone else, Caleb was a fixture. The guy who changed the light bulbs. The guy who showed up early, cleaned the conference rooms, and quietly vanished before anyone truly noticed. But today, he wasn't invisible. Today, the janitor was the center of the room. Caleb looked up at the screen. He tilted his head, then pulled a rag from his pocket to clean the smudge on his glasses. The room remained silent. I'll give it a try, if that's all right, he said, his voice soft but clear. Richard raised an eyebrow. By all means, impress us. Caleb walked to the whiteboard. It still held half-solved attempts from the morning meeting. He picked up a marker, paused, then wiped the board clean. I hope you don't mind if I start fresh, he said, not waiting for permission. He began to write. Not just numbers. Not just formulas. But logic. Thought. Understanding. He broke the equation into 3 parts, underlining one section in red. The error starts here, he said, pointing. This assumption contradicts the previous output. It looks complex, but it's actually recursive. Recursive? Someone whispered. The head of data engineering leaned forward. I saw a version of this in a systems modeling course I audited back in college, Caleb said without turning around. But you've combined it with a linear demand forecast that ignores seasonality. He corrected the structure. He identified missing variables. And finally, he presented a simplified solution. Then he stepped back. That's the correct model. And if applied, it'll adjust your Q3 predictions by 7 to 10%. No one breathed. The CTO squinted at the board. The CFO opened his laptop and started typing furiously. Richard's smirk was gone. For a few seconds, all you could hear was the low hum of the AC. Caleb, the janitor, had solved the riddle. And not just solved it, he had understood it in a way that none of them had. "Who are you?" the CEO asked, his voice lower now, no trace of humor left. Caleb looked up. "Just a man who reads. A man who listens." How many times have we judged someone based on their uniform? Their job? Their silence? Would you challenge someone based on how they look? Or would you give them a chance to surprise you? Stay with us, because what happens next will change how this entire company sees the world. Backhand index pointing down like, comment, and share if you believe in second chances, and in hidden genius. Next up, what was Caleb's story? And why was he a janitor in the first place? The whiteboard looked different now. Not messy, not crowded, but precise, clean, structured, and strangely beautiful. Like an architect's sketch or a composer's music sheet. Caleb had rewritten the puzzle in his own hand. Lines of logic curved across the board like a river finding its course. Blake Industries' top minds, all graduates from Ivy League schools and seasoned with decades of corporate warfare, watched in silence as a man in a janitor's uniform explained concepts they should have known. Richard Blake, the CEO, no longer laughed. He was silent now, arms folded, lips pursed, eyes locked on the whiteboard. One of the VPs leaned in and whispered to the CFO, "He's actually doing it right. That recursive function he just built, it's elegant. Why didn't we think of that?" The CFO didn't respond. He was already double-checking Caleb's logic on his tablet. Caleb, unaware of the growing tension, continued breaking the problem down. He turned to the group and said, "See this variable here? You're treating it like it's constant. But in real market conditions, especially in this economy, it fluctuates hourly. That's why your model was failing." The head of business intelligence blinked. He was right. They'd been basing quarterly decisions on an outdated assumption. This janitor had just saved them millions. The original puzzle had been created to test strategic thinking. It was built around a fictional market scenario where the supply chain, demand, cost of raw materials, and user behavior all intersected, something the company's R&D team had spent weeks crafting. But no one had noticed the pattern Caleb did. No one saw the flawed logic hidden in the equation. Why? Because everyone had been focused on solving it quickly, on impressing Richard Blake. Caleb. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to understand. "May I?" Caleb asked again, motioning toward the main screen. Richard nodded, still too stunned to speak. Caleb tapped a few keys and brought up the company's internal forecast tool. He inputted his modified version of the formula. The graph shifted instantly. Revenue projections became more accurate. Risk factors aligned with current market trends. The predictive model, which had been showing a 12% dip in Q3, now revealed only a 2% dip, if action was taken quickly. The room stirred. This could fix our Q3 projection issues," said the CFO, voice tight with disbelief. The chief data officer walked to the screen. This janitor just corrected a 6-week analytics failure in under 15 minutes. Richard finally spoke. "What's your background, Caleb?" The janitor wiped his hands with the cloth from his pocket and turned around. "I have a degree in applied mathematics. Worked at AlphaCore for 10 years. Then my wife got sick, and I stepped away to take care of her. After she passed, I just wanted something simple. So I took this job." He said it without bitterness, without drama, just facts. The kind that make your stomach sink. A man this talented, this intelligent, and no one in the company had ever thought to talk to him beyond, "Can you mop the boardroom?" "I didn't want titles anymore," Caleb continued softly. "Just peace. I clean. I listen. I read. Sometimes, I peek at the puzzles you leave on the screen. The entire leadership team looked down, embarrassed, ashamed. They'd laughed, mocked, dismissed. And yet Caleb had responded with grace, not anger. You know, Richard finally said, his voice softer now, this puzzle was meant to expose critical thinking gaps. I never expected a janitor to solve it. I'm not offended, Caleb replied with a faint smile. Most people don't expect the quiet ones to speak up. That's okay. But you didn't just solve it, the CTO chimed in. You revealed flaws in our entire approach. That's something none of us caught. Then Richard took a breath, and did something no one expected. He stood up and walked toward Caleb. Extending a hand, he said, Caleb, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an opportunity. Caleb looked at the hand. The mop still hung by his side. The stain on his shirt from earlier still showed. But in that moment, he wasn't a janitor anymore. He was a man standing at the center of a room full of executives, with every eye on him in respect. Richard continued, let's forget the joke. I may not give you the company, but how would you feel about stepping into a real role? One where your mind is used, not ignored. A hush fell again, because this was no longer about puzzles. It was about power, about perspective, and how easy it is to overlook the genius standing quietly in the shadows. The whiteboard was now filled with clean lines, confident numbers, and crisp logic. The puzzle, once considered unsolvable, had been transformed into something elegant and readable. Caleb stood at the center, still holding the marker in his rough, calloused hand. But the janitor everyone once ignored was now being watched with awe. No one moved. No one interrupted. They were all spellbound, because this wasn't just a man solving a problem. This was a masterclass in thinking. The CEO, Richard Blake, stood behind Caleb now, eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in curiosity. He wasn't seeing a janitor anymore. He was seeing a strategist, a visionary. Caleb turned to the room. I didn't mean to intrude, he said, almost apologetically. But the model you used, it has a blind spot. You assumed all consumer behavior follows a direct growth curve based on trendline analysis. He paused and gestured to a variable he had rewritten. But the market, especially now, responds in waves. Emotional waves. Panic, confidence, panic again. Your model needed a behavioral coefficient to account for volatility spikes. That's what I added. He stepped away from the board, allowing others to examine it. The CTO stepped forward. You created a volatility coefficient, on the fly? That's not in our base model. I know, Caleb said. But I've been watching your teams work from the side. Every time I cleaned the glass walls during your meetings, I saw the same error appear in different formats. There was no boast in his voice, just quiet conviction, and that made it hit harder. The head of R&D now stood inches from the board, running through the logic. I've been battling this for weeks. This one adjustment solves the domino failure in our predictive AI. The CFO muttered, do you realize what this means for our quarterly risk buffer? The room, once filled with silent judgment, was now filled with noisy realization. Then came a moment that changed everything. Caleb, said the CTO, how long did it take you to figure this out? Caleb thought for a second. About 20 minutes. I saw the root issue earlier this week when I passed by this room during your presentation. I didn't want to say anything. Why not? Because I'm the janitor. The words hung in the air. It was the simplest answer, but the most painful to hear. He hadn't spoken up because no one would have believed him. Because society taught him not to. Because he knew exactly how he would have been treated. And the truth of that, it stung. Richard sat down slowly in the leather chair at the head of the table, running a hand through his silver hair. The room was quiet again, only this time, it wasn't because of judgment. It was because they all knew they had missed something big. Not just a math problem. They had missed a man. A story. A talent. You've been working here for how long? Richard finally asked. Almost 2 years, Caleb replied. And no one ever asked you what you did before? Caleb shrugged. A few people did. I said I used to work in data. But after I lost my wife, I didn't really want to talk about it. I just needed a job. A routine. The HR director looked at her notepad, ashamed. We never screened him properly. We just slotted him in as part-time facilities staff. Richard leaned back, then leaned forward again, elbows on the table. You know, Caleb, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Most of us in this room have the first. You've shown us the second. The compliment was genuine. Caleb smiled faintly, but he wasn't gloating. He wasn't trying to prove anything. I appreciate that, sir. I don't need praise. I just wanted to fix something broken. A silence followed, one that felt heavy and thoughtful. Then Richard stood again. You've done more than that, he said. You've shown us how blind we've been. You didn't just fix a model, you changed how we see people. How we see you. Richard turned to his executives. Effective today, I want Caleb evaluated for strategic consulting. I want a full employment package built, equity included. And I want him leading a special task force on our forecasting division. The room nodded. No one objected. They couldn't. Because they'd seen genius. Not in a resume. Not in a title. But in a moment of truth. As the room began to clear, a young intern walked up to Caleb. Sir, that was amazing. Caleb smiled gently. Thank you. But don't call me sir. I'm just Caleb. No, the intern said. You're the smartest person in this building. Caleb chuckled. I'm just someone who watches. Sometimes, the best way to understand a problem is to be quiet long enough to see it clearly. The whiteboard was still glowing under the warm lights. Caleb had stepped back, the marker now resting in the tray. Executives gathered around it like pilgrims at a shrine, reading, decoding, nodding slowly. And yet, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent. Like they were witnessing something sacred. Something that demanded quiet not out of discomfort, but out of respect. The CFO broke the silence first. This model, if implemented, it doesn't just fix the Q3 forecast, she said, flipping through her tablet's data. It shifts our entire fiscal strategy. Caleb identified a revenue stream buried under consumer churn. We've been leaving millions on the table for 3 quarters straight. More murmurs. More widened eyes. The kind of silence that comes before change. Caleb stood near the wall now, letting them talk. He hadn't taken a seat. Not because he wasn't offered one, but because he didn't need it. He wasn't trying to fit in. He was trying to be useful. But Richard Blake, the once proud CEO who had laughed at him less than an hour ago, was no longer sitting either. He was pacing. Deep in thought. It wasn't just the brilliance of Caleb's solution that troubled him. It was what it revealed. If one janitor could catch a mistake that a team of executives couldn't, what else was being missed? I need everyone to listen, Richard finally said, facing the boardroom. This isn't just about fixing a model. This is about rethinking how we lead, how we listen, how we look at people. He turned to Caleb. I was wrong, he said, his voice level. I mocked you, dismissed you, and in doing so, I almost ignored the smartest man in this room. Heads nodded. Eyes dropped in shame. Even the CTO looked shaken. Caleb, Richard continued, you mentioned earlier you saw this pattern a few times before. Did you keep track of any other models? Caleb gave a small nod. I did. I kept a notebook. The room collectively leaned in. Richard's eyebrows lifted. A notebook. Yes. Caleb replied. Not to spy or anything, I just like solving problems. Every now and then, I'd see the forecasting charts on the hallway displays, or on the screens when I was cleaning at night. Some numbers didn't sit right. He reached into his worn backpack and pulled out a brown leather-bound notebook. A little frayed. Some pages folded. Others tabbed with sticky notes. He opened to a marked section and handed it to the head of data science. She scanned a page, then another, then her mouth fell open. He's backtraced 2 years of forecasting errors. He's even proposed revised consumer retention funnels. And he's mapped our pricing tiers against inflation-adjusted household income bands, something we haven't done yet. Now, the silence returned, but it was even deeper. It was the kind of silence that comes after hearing something that fundamentally changes how you see the world. How you see yourself. I was going to publish a blog with the suggestions anonymously, Caleb said, almost nervously. But I didn't want it to seem like I was stepping out of line. I didn't think anyone would take me seriously. A long pause. Then Richard spoke slowly. We didn't take you seriously, because we never even thought to ask who you were. There it was. The truth. The bitter, undeniable truth. Not just about Caleb, but about all the overlooked minds out there. All the quiet talents crushed under assumptions and titles and job descriptions. One of the newer VPs, a woman in her early 30s, broke the tension. I started here 6 months ago. I've passed Caleb at least a dozen times. I never even said hi. That says more about me than it does about him. Others began nodding, admitting their own guilt, their own blindness. It was no longer just a corporate meeting. It had become a mirror, and everyone was being forced to look into it. Richard picked up the notebook and handed it back to Caleb with both hands, almost like returning a holy book. I'm going to say something I never thought I'd say in this room, he said, voice steady. This man just taught us all how to think. He paused. And how to lead. Everyone in that room, VPs, directors, analysts, stood. Not because they were told to, but because they had to. They clapped. Not a casual, polite clap, but one that echoed. One that meant something. For the first time, Caleb didn't look away. He accepted the moment, not with pride, but with humility. Because deep down, he had always known who he was. It just took everyone else this long to catch up. The applause eventually faded, but the weight of the moment lingered. Caleb, still standing near the board, clutched the leather notebook in both hands. He wasn't smiling wide or soaking in the spotlight. He looked reflective, like someone who had lived through storms and was only now stepping into the sunlight. Richard Blake, the CEO, approached him, not with the swagger of a corporate king, but with the humility of a man who just had his worldview shattered. Caleb, he said softly, I'd like to know more about you. About your story. The room agreed with a silence that begged for answers. Caleb looked around. His eyes met those of the people who had ignored him for years. Now, those same eyes were filled with curiosity and regret. I don't like talking about the past much, he began, his voice low and calm. But maybe it's time. He took a breath and placed the notebook down gently on the table. Then, with his palms resting flat on the surface, he spoke. Not like a janitor, not like an analyst, but like a man who had learned life the hard way. I wasn't always a janitor, he began. I used to work at a firm called Alpha Core, lead analyst in their forecasting division. I had a team of 15 under me. We did great work. My forecasts were used by some of the biggest retail chains in the country. The executives listened intently. Some had heard of Alpha Core. It was a prestigious firm and hard to get into. I loved that job, Caleb continued. But I loved my family more. He looked down for a moment. His eyes shimmered, not with pride this time, but with memory. My wife, Tricia, was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. Our daughter was just 8. I tried juggling work and hospital visits, tried hiring help, tried everything. But eventually, I had to choose. A pause. I chose her. You could hear a pin drop in that room. Not a whisper. Not a shuffle. Just the sound of breathing, and the occasional throat being cleared to hide the emotion rising up. I quit my job. Sold the house. We moved to a smaller town, rented a tiny place near the hospital. I became her full-time caregiver. Caleb's hands trembled just slightly. Not from weakness, but from the weight of remembering. She fought hard. Harder than I ever could. But the cancer spread. After 18 months, she passed away. He stopped. Even Richard looked down, rubbing his chin slowly. When it was over, Caleb said, I didn't know who I was anymore. My daughter was all I had left. She was traumatized, fragile, and I didn't want to uproot her again. So we stayed here in the city. I applied to dozens of places, but no one wanted to hire a man who'd been out of the field for 2 years. He gave a bitter chuckle. They said my skills were rusty. That I needed to prove myself again. I didn't have time for that. I needed to pay rent. So I walked into Blake Industries. Saw an opening for a janitor. I applied. No one knew what to say. Because what could they say? This wasn't a story about missed opportunity. This was a story about resilience, sacrifice, and the cruel irony of being overqualified and invisible at the same time. Caleb continued. I told myself it was temporary. That I'd figure something out later. But you know how life works. Later becomes next month, and next month becomes a year. He smiled gently. But in that time, I found peace. I got to walk my daughter to school. I got to read again, think again, and I got to solve problems without pressure. He pointed to the board. Just like that one. Someone sniffled. The VP of marketing quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. Caleb had not only revealed his brilliance, he had revealed his humanity. And it was humbling. Richard walked over and placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. You've given more value in one afternoon than most executives give in a year, he said, his voice tight. And you did it while carrying pain none of us saw. Caleb nodded slowly. I didn't come here for sympathy. I came here for a paycheck. But I stayed because, sometimes being unseen gives you the best view of everything. One of the interns, clearly shaken, whispered to the CTO, why don't we have people like him in our strategy meetings? The CTO answered with a whisper just as honest. Because we never asked. And that's on us. Caleb reached down and zipped up his old backpack. I think I've said enough, he said politely. I should get back to my rounds. Not anymore, Richard said firmly. You don't report to facilities anymore. Starting today, you report directly to me. A quiet murmur passed through the room. I want you advising me, on strategy, on culture, on people. Because clearly, you see what the rest of us don't. Caleb hesitated. Are you sure? Richard smiled. No, but you are. And that's enough for me. The next morning, the glass doors of Blake Industries opened like they always did. Employees filed in with coffees in hand, heads down, earbuds in, minds already buzzing with numbers, meetings, and deadlines. But something felt different. Word had spread. About the janitor. About the boardroom. About the puzzle that none of the executives could solve. Except him. People looked around, almost nervously. Some glanced at the elevators, wondering if they'd catch a glimpse of Caleb. No longer the janitor, but now the man who outsmarted the board. And then he walked in. Same boots. Same bag. Same quiet presence. But this time, people didn't ignore him. They stood up. Smiled. Nodded. One employee actually opened the elevator door for him and said, After you, sir. Upstairs, things had already started to shift. Richard Blake, the CEO, had spent the night in deep thought. He called an early meeting with HR, legal, and strategy. His instructions were clear. Caleb isn't just joining leadership. We're changing how we find, treat, and grow people like him, from the ground up. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a cultural shift. At 9:30 a.m., a company-wide email went out with the subject line, "Every voice matters. Meet our new strategic advisor." Attached was a photo of Caleb, standing humbly beside a whiteboard. His notebook was visible in the corner, almost like a symbol of everything he represented: quiet intelligence, invisible resilience, and untapped genius. The email didn't include his resume. It didn't list awards or degrees. It told his story. And it ended with a quote from Caleb himself. "Sometimes, the ones who see the clearest are those you notice the least." In the cafeteria later that day, something incredible happened. A young woman from accounting stood up and said, "I'd like to nominate the mailroom guy, Reggie, for our internal innovation contest. He helped automate our supply tracker with an Excel script last month, and none of us even thought to highlight it." Heads turned. Applause followed. All because Caleb had unlocked something in the company. Not just insight, but permission. Permission to see beyond job titles. To listen. To ask. To care. Meanwhile, Caleb was settling into his new office on the 17th floor. It wasn't flashy. No gold nameplates or executive couches. Just a simple desk, a laptop, and a whiteboard. And the notebook, of course. The HR director, Samantha, knocked softly on the door. "Hey, Caleb. We finished drafting your new contract. Full-time strategic advisor, starting salary triple your previous one. Full benefits. Also, Richard wanted me to tell you, he's naming the internal mentorship program after you. The Caleb Initiative." Caleb blinked. "I don't know what to say." "You already did," she smiled. "Yesterday. Loud and clear." That afternoon, Caleb was invited to speak briefly at a leadership town hall. He didn't want to. "I'm not a speaker," he said. "I fix things. I solve. I think." But Richard nudged him gently. "Sometimes, sharing your truth is the biggest fix of all." So Caleb stood in front of hundreds of employees. No suit. No PowerPoint. Just a man, holding a notebook, speaking from the heart. "I was happy being invisible," he began. "But that's not the same as being valued. And I think many of you feel the same." He looked around the room. "You do your jobs. You go home. You stay quiet. And sometimes you wonder, does anyone see me?" Silence. "But I see you now. And if my story means anything, it means this: you don't have to be loud to be brilliant. You don't have to lead a department to lead an idea." Thunderous applause. For a man who once mopped these very floors. After the event, dozens of employees lined up to shake his hand. Security guards. Mailroom workers. Junior staff. Even executives. One young programmer in his first week said, "Sir, I didn't think I belonged here. But after today, I know I do." Back on the executive floor, the change was even more profound. The VPs were meeting with their teams differently now, asking questions, not just giving orders. Departments started hosting open-floor problem-solving hours, where anyone from any level could offer input. They called it the Caleb Hour. And the results? Stunning. Ideas flowed. Bottlenecks vanished. People felt heard. But not everything was easy. There were skeptics. Some quietly said, "Let's see how long this lasts." Others grumbled. "He got lucky. One puzzle doesn't make you a genius." Caleb heard those whispers. And he smiled. Because he didn't need to prove anything. He had already lived through worse. Doubt couldn't break a man who had buried his wife and raised a child alone. 2 weeks after the boardroom breakthrough, Blake Industries was a different place. People walked a little taller. Meetings sounded a little more human. From the top floor to the basement, something had shifted, not just in structure, but in spirit. And at the center of it all was Caleb. Not because he asked to be there, but because he earned it. In that short time, Caleb had already saved the company $2.3 million by reworking their predictive analytics. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't post about it on LinkedIn. He just wrote quietly in his notebook, presented solid solutions, and let the numbers speak louder than any resume ever could. But what happened next caught even Caleb by surprise. One Friday afternoon, Richard Blake called an emergency meeting. Not the kind with an agenda. Not the kind with buzzwords like KPIs or quarterly alignment. This was different. Caleb was asked to attend, but when he walked into the boardroom, he noticed something unusual. Everyone was already standing. Not seated. Not distracted. Waiting. At the head of the table, Richard stood beside a screen that displayed just one line. Vision 2030, Reimagining Leadership. Richard cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "And thank you, Caleb, for joining us." He looked across the room. "I've been in this industry for over 3 decades. I've seen talent. I've seen fraud. I've seen loyalty, betrayal, growth, failure, all of it. But in all those years, I've never seen what I saw 2 weeks ago." He turned to Caleb. "You didn't just solve a puzzle. You redefined what leadership can look like." He paused. The room was still. "Which is why, effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO." Gasps echoed around the room. Even Caleb's mouth opened slightly. "Wait, what?" Richard raised a hand gently. "I'm not retiring. I'm not leaving the company. But I am moving into a new role, chairman of the board. And I want the person who sees clearly, thinks deeply, and leads humbly, to take the reins." He turned fully toward Caleb now. "Caleb, I'm offering you the role of CEO of Blake Industries." The silence that followed could have lasted a lifetime. Everyone looked at Caleb. Shocked. Awed. Caleb looked stunned. He stepped back slightly. "Mr. Blake, I appreciate the trust. I do. But I'm not sure I'm the right fit for that kind of power." "You don't seek power, Caleb," Richard replied. "That's exactly why you're the right person." The room stayed frozen as Caleb processed the moment. He saw images in his mind. His wife, Tricia, in the hospital bed. His daughter's first day of school. The mop handle he held not long ago. The night he ate instant noodles in a tiny kitchen wondering how he'd pay rent the next month. And now, this. A company. A title. A stage. Caleb looked up. "I'm honored. Truly. But may I propose something different?" A ripple went through the room. "I don't need to be CEO," Caleb said. "But I want to build something inside this company. Something sustainable. Something that finds people like me before they're overlooked." He walked toward the board. "I want to create a new division, VisionOps. A think tank inside Blake Industries. One that pulls talent from unconventional places. We'll solve real problems. Design bold solutions. And give the floor to people who don't normally get a seat at the table." Richard's eyes lit up. "I was hoping you'd say something like that," he said. Caleb smiled. "I'll serve where I'm most useful, not where the title is the loudest." The boardroom erupted in applause. People weren't just impressed, they were inspired. Because once again, Caleb had shown them something rare. That true leadership isn't about taking the top seat. It's about lifting others into the light. 2 days later, Richard officially announced Caleb's new role as Chief Vision Officer, reporting only to the board. His first task? Build a team from the inside. Janitors, mailroom workers, coders, designers, analysts, anyone with a sharp mind and a good heart. They didn't have to have perfect grammar on their resumes. They just had to care. And they came. By the dozens. A single internal email from Caleb titled, "Your Voice Matters. Join me," received over 140 replies in 2 hours. People shared projects they'd built after hours. Spreadsheets they'd improved. Scripts they'd written but never submitted. One junior designer had developed a mobile app idea that saved the company $300,000 in onboarding costs. Another worker from the shipping dock had a fix for the logistics tracking system that none of the tech team had thought of. Caleb reviewed every single submission himself. Not one was ignored, because he knew how that felt. By the end of the quarter, VisionOps wasn't just a division, it was the heart of the company. Innovation soared. Turnover dropped. Morale reached all-time highs. And it all started with a man who used to clean floors. A man who turned down the corner office so others could rise. The sign on the office door read, "VisionOps, powered by people, not position." It wasn't made of glass or gold. It was wooden, simple, like everything Caleb stood for. Inside the room was no ordinary workspace. There were no cubicle walls. No hierarchies. Just wide tables, whiteboards filled with sketches and math, and corners for quiet thinking. At the head of it all was Caleb, once the janitor, now the soul of Blake Industries. But if you walked in, you'd never know. He still wore the same boots. Still carried that same old leather notebook. Still preferred sitting in a chair that didn't spin. What had changed wasn't his outfit. What changed was how the world looked at him. And more importantly, how the world started looking at everyone else. The VisionOps team was now 25 people strong, and not one of them had applied through traditional channels. There was Lisa, the cafeteria assistant who built a supply tracking app on her phone after work hours. There was James, the overnight security guard who created a machine learning model to detect building energy waste. And Maya, the junior admin who redesigned internal training documents so well that HR adopted them company-wide. They had always been brilliant. They had just been invisible. Until Caleb opened the door. Meanwhile, Blake Industries had never performed better. Productivity soared. Customer satisfaction hit record highs. And turnover down by 38%. But more than the numbers, the culture had changed. Now, interns spoke up in strategy meetings. Engineers listened to drivers during product rollouts. And executives walked the halls without pretending they were too important to say hello. The ripple effect of Caleb's humility had reached every level. Richard Blake, now chairman, often said, "I ran this company for 20 years. Caleb transformed it in 20 days. But Caleb didn't care about credit. He had a different metric for success. At 6 p.m. every day, he'd leave the office, walk down to the first floor, and make one round of the building. He'd nod at the janitors, smile at the maintenance staff, high-five the delivery guy, because he remembered what it felt like to be on the outside of the glass. One day, a young woman named Olivia, an intern just 3 weeks into her role, stopped Caleb in the hall. "Mr. Caleb?" He turned, gently correcting her. "Just Caleb. I wanted to thank you. You don't know me, but last week you visited our training room and listened to our ideas. I was one of the people who spoke up. I'd never felt like my words mattered before." Caleb smiled. "But they do matter. All of them." She looked down at her notebook, shyly. "I want to be like you someday." He chuckled softly. "Then listen, learn, and never, ever judge someone by their title." That night, Caleb walked back to his desk in VisionOps. He looked around at the team, buzzing with ideas. He wasn't shouting commands or giving orders. He was listening. Always listening. Because that was his greatest strength. Not his genius. Not his equations. But his willingness to see others, truly see them. Back in the boardroom, the executive team had started a new tradition. Every Monday, the leadership meeting started with 5 minutes of recognition. Not for performance metrics. Not for revenue wins. But for people who had been previously overlooked, those who had quietly changed something, fixed something, or lifted someone else. They called it the Caleb moment. And then came the biggest surprise of all. One morning, Caleb's daughter, Amara, now 13, came to the office for Bring Your Child to Work Day. She wore her mother's scarf. Caleb noticed it the moment she walked in and nearly teared up, but he smiled instead. He introduced her to the team. "This is the smartest person I know," he said proudly. Amara giggled, hiding behind her backpack. But as she looked around, watching everyone treat her father with admiration and respect, something shifted in her too. Because she had once watched him mop floors to keep the lights on. And now, he was building lights for others. That evening, as they walked home, Amara asked, "Dad, do you ever miss being the janitor?" He thought for a second, then nodded. "Sometimes." "Why?" "Because no one expected anything from me. And when you're invisible, you learn a lot. You see what matters. That's where I learned to lead." Amara smiled. "Then maybe that's where I'll start too." Years had passed since that one moment in the boardroom. Since a janitor was asked to solve a problem as a joke. And ended up solving the company. But the story of Caleb Johnson didn't fade like a trending post or a quarterly headline. It grew. Because the lesson he left behind wasn't printed in manuals. It was planted in hearts. Blake Industries was no longer just a business. It had become a case study in human potential. Universities taught the Caleb model in business ethics and leadership seminars. MBAs quoted him. Startups tried to copy VisionOps. But no one could replicate the soul behind it. Because what Caleb created wasn't a system. It was a shift in consciousness. One crisp autumn morning, the company hosted a special event, Innovation Day. Employees from every department, no matter their title, were invited to present ideas that could shape the company's future. The auditorium was packed. Janitors, engineers, accountants, cafeteria workers, security. And at the center, wearing his old boots and a clean shirt, sat Caleb, now senior advisor and honorary board member. He had turned down titles. Twice. He never took the CEO seat. But everyone still called him the company's moral compass. The lights dimmed. A short documentary began to play. It was titled, "The Janitor Who Taught Us to See." Clips showed Caleb cleaning the whiteboard years ago. Pausing to glance at the puzzle. Then, quietly solving it as the boardroom watched in disbelief. The next scene, Caleb telling his story, his wife, the struggle, the choice to walk away from prestige to protect love. Sniffles echoed across the audience. Some cried openly. Others sat frozen, their hearts heavy with respect. The film ended with Caleb's quote, "Don't just lead from the top. Listen from the bottom." Thunderous applause followed. People didn't just clap, they stood. Because this wasn't a tribute to a man. It was a confession that the world had been blind for too long. That value doesn't wear a badge. That leadership doesn't always stand at the front of the room. Sometimes, it mops the floors before sunrise. After the event, a 19-year-old intern approached Caleb backstage. She was shy, holding a folder filled with sketches. "Mr. Caleb, I don't know if my ideas matter, but I've been working on a redesign for our mobile platform. Would you look at it?" He took the folder with both hands. Looked her in the eye. "If you believe in them," he said, "then they already matter." She smiled, eyes wide. "Thank you." And in that moment, he wasn't the janitor who rose. He was the man who never stopped lifting others. Months later, Caleb quietly announced his retirement. No press conference. No champagne. Just an email. "It's time for me to go build treehouses with my granddaughter. But I leave you with this. Keep looking for the invisible ones. Because I was one of them once. At his farewell event, Richard Blake gave a short speech. He raised a glass and said, "Caleb changed this company more than I ever did. Not with a budget. Not with a merger. But with a moment of truth, and a mind built in silence." Then, he turned to Caleb. "On behalf of every life you've touched, thank you." As Caleb walked out of the building for the last time, dozens of employees lined the hallway. Not with balloons or banners, but with notebooks in their hands, each one holding a handwritten page of what they learned from him. Speak less. Observe more. Lead with humility. Look beyond the surface. Kindness is data, too. He passed them one by one, nodding, smiling, until he reached the front door. The same one he used to enter before sunrise, mop in hand. But this time, he walked out a legend. Years later, long after he was gone, people still told his story. Not because he built empires, but because he built people. Because he reminded a busy world that wisdom doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers. And when we finally hear it, we're changed forever. Backhand index pointing right. Have you ever ignored someone just because of their job, clothes, or background? Caleb's story isn't fiction, it's a reminder. Brain genius has no dress code. Red heart humility is the highest form of power. Fire leadership is not about position. It's about vision, compassion, and courage. Speech balloon drop. Thank you, Caleb, in the comments if this story touched you. Loudspeaker share it with someone who needs a reminder that they are more than what the world sees. Bell, and if you believe in the power of the underdog, subscribe, because we have more stories that prove quiet people can shake the world.